Welcome to another Dr. Sadler's Honest Review. This time I'm going to be looking at the book More Than Happiness, Buddhist and Stoic Wisdom for a Skeptical Age by Antonia Macaro, who I'll tell you about in just a minute. So this is a series that this book fits solidly into because what I'm doing is reviewing recent books primarily in practical philosophy. So philosophy as it has to do with our lives, our relationships, our jobs. So you can expect there's also a good bit of overlap with self-help and personal development and leadership studies as well. Now, Antonia Macaro is somebody who I've actually met at the Stoicon that was held in London, I believe in 2018, where both of us were presenters. And she has been part of the philosophical counseling movement in England and Europe for quite some time, really since its beginnings there. She is a psychotherapist and also somebody who has done quite a lot of research into these fields. So it turns out it's really quite an excellent book. She gave me a copy a while back when I began doing these reviews, and I'm just finally getting to it now. So we always start off with a little bit about the style, the structure, and some summary of the work. And let me say that this is actually a fairly short, but you know, I won't say dense in the bad sense of being impenetrable or anything like that, but there's a lot packed into this. So there's 178 pages of total text and then quite a few endnotes and book recommendations and references and a really great index as well. And it's organized, as you can expect, into chapters, and I'll just run through them very quickly. So there's an introduction, chapter 1 setting the scene, talking about what the book is about and how she's going to proceed. And then she dives right in chapter 2 with dukkha happens. Dukkha, of course, is a Buddhist term that's often translated as suffering. And so she's looking at the Buddhist framework for understanding and to some degree dealing with suffering. What is the origin of it? Then chapter 3, she moves over to the Stoics, maladies of the soul, why we suffer. And there's a kind of alternating that's going to go on for a bit. Chapter 4, how to be saved. Number 1, nirvana. So that's the Buddhist response. Chapter 5, how to be saved. Number 2, living in accordance with nature. Stoic response, right? And then she brings those two key themes together with the remaining chapters. So chapter 6 is More Than Happiness, the title of the book, right? So that's a really central chapter for the entire work. Chapter 7, removing the dust from our eyes, looking at how we wind up in a lot of different mistaken errors. Chapter 8 is called The Sage and the Buddha, Models for Living. It's actually a little bit misnamed, I would say, because there's a lot of other stuff packed in there. That you can say the sage, the Stoic sage, and the Buddha and Bodhisattvas and whatever other beings you want to talk about are in fact practicing these, but it's mostly about their ideas. Then there's a discussion in chapter 9 of spiritual practice beyond theory, the need to actually do this stuff, not just read about it, as the Stoics and the Buddhists have reminded us. Finally, chapter 10 contains a really nicely thought out set of meditations, also practices for a better life. And, you know, this is, in terms of style, it's very readable. Macaro has a great way of discussing these things in very down-to-earth terms, but without losing, I would say, as somebody who's studied this stuff, without losing rigor in the process. So I think it's really quite good the way she's doing it. It's very well organized, very well thought through. Clearly, the you know, outcome of a lot of thinking and applying these things. And the one other thing I'll say in terms of summary is that she's committed to this view that Buddhism and Stoicism need to be rethought, or as she says at one point, resized. And you notice the subtitle, For a Skeptical Age. So that's going to play a central part in it. So that gives you some idea about what you're getting into if you choose to read this book. This is something that I would say if you had like a full afternoon and you wanted to sit down and read your way through it, and you already were familiar with some of it, you could probably read the entire work in an afternoon, or you could space it out over time as well. I'm not going to try to summarize the entire work in depth for you. I'll just talk about a few really key and central points that I would say run through the entire work. And one of these is that both Buddhism and Stoicism really offer a lot to their practitioners. They are both robust. You can call them philosophical. In the case of Buddhism, you can also talk about it as being a religious system. There's a bit of debate about that, and she summarizes some of that in here quite well. In any case, they're robust systems for understanding the problems and solutions in life. They also are quite demanding of their practitioners if you want to get the full package, if you want to derive all the benefits that are being preferred by these orientations or these perspectives, right? So she recognizes that, and she says, maybe we don't want to be committed to everything that's there in Buddhism or everything that's there in Stoicism. So it's clearly in terms of Stoicism, what we'd call a modern Stoic book, right? And she's offering a way of looking at these things that she doesn't say, is the single way to do it, but is quite persuasive. Her point of view, as she summarizes it, is going to be naturalistic, meaning that we don't want to bring in all sorts of supernatural entities. And she notes that when it comes to, say, the Stoics versus the Buddhists, in some respect, the Stoics have a bit of an edge on Buddhism as it's actually historically practiced by people. There's less supernatural elements about it. And she stresses that the Buddha himself was not particularly given to talking about metaphysics, except later texts that where the Buddha is essentially being used perhaps as a kind of mouthpiece. And so this is a very modern point of view. She wants to have a sort of skeptical attitude about things. And now there's different kinds of skepticism, so this is worth actually dwelling on a bit. For example, in the beginning of the work, she talks about, well, here's a great line right here before we get into setting the scene. She says, "My main aim is to explore what we can extricate that fits in with a naturalistic questioning point of view, but that is more than just tips on how to be happy. I've chosen to concentrate on both traditions, the parts of them that have the potential to make an impact, challenging rather than indulging received notions, etc., right?" And she goes on, and in the setting the scene, she tells us, listen, when it comes to Buddhism, we don't actually know that much historically about this guy, Siddhartha Gautama, who had an enlightenment. The texts that we're getting are written down much later, based on oral traditions. And she's right, within the scholarship of Buddhism, the serious scholarship, there's a lot of maybe this. And the point is, we don't actually have to be that tied to those things. There's something I should point out. There's a quest for the historical Jesus. There's also a quest for the historical Buddha, a quest for the historical Confucius. This is what we call the realm of the historical or historicality. And, the skepticism that she has is mostly aimed at sort of pushing away the stuff that isn't going to be particularly helpful and trying to get to the core of what could be useful for us in the present. She's not doing what some people have done in the past, which is to say, well, we push this stuff away and we've got the core of the historical Buddha right here. No, she's not that concerned with that. And we can say a similar thing about Stoicism as well. We don't have any of the original texts of Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, or of Chrysippus, the so-called second founder, the third scholarch of the school. We have bits and pieces of what they've said preserved in other people's work, and then we get these accounts coming in from people like Cicero, who's not himself a Stoic, but is attracted to Stoicism and sees a lot of value in it. And then we get the late Roman Stoics. We have, Epictetus and Seneca, Marcus Aurelius. We have bits of Epictetus's teacher, Musonius Rufus's stuff. We have Heracles. And then we have another summary coming from Arius Didymus and other bits and pieces. So we got to kind of put the picture together, and that means that we don't have to be dogmatically committed to this particular interpretation or this particular interpretation. So that's something running through her work that plays a major role. I would say another thing that's going on within her work is she's doing a great job in showing how Buddhism and Stoicism are both focusing on some constants of human nature, and not just human nature of us as a kind of species, an animal, right? But as rational beings that live in societies. There's certain things that were bedeviling people and causing them to be, upset and troubled and doing the same stupid thing over and over again back in ancient times in India and everywhere else that Buddhism spread to, and in ancient Greece and Rome where Stoicism caught on and spread to other places as well. So, that's something worth focusing on as well. And she also brings out the fact that, or the feature rather, that Buddhism and Stoicism, although they're not merely therapies, they are therapeutic. They are doing the job of therapy, ministering to the human being in order to allow them to attain something better for themselves. Happiness, the happy life, or something more than happiness, to use the title. The last point that I'll bring up by way of summary is that there's a lot of focus in here on the emotions as understood both from Buddhist perspectives and Stoic perspectives, but also from psychological perspectives of theories of the current times and Aristotelian perspectives as well. So there's a lot of great discussion of emotion and different viewpoints that you could take on it within this text. I've already mentioned a few good features about this work, but there's a number of other ones that I do want to bring up and highlight about Macaro's book and the thought that is so clearly running behind it and within it. And I'll level with you right now. I highly recommend you get this book. I think it's really quite great. And I am kicking myself a bit for leaving it on my shelf for so long before getting to it. So the first good point is really, really well thought through. Again, as somebody who has been engaging with both of these main traditions and quite a few of the other ones that she talks about in the work, particularly the Aristotelian tradition, this is the kind of book where you're like, man, I wish I'd written that book. This is really well put together and has just enough to it to lead you into the stuff without overwhelming you with detail. She has a very judicious approach to things. There's no partisanship in it. She's saying, well, the Buddhists have this and the Stoics have this. Let's take this part. Let's take this part. This is good. We're going to leave this behind. Hey, the Aristotelians over here, they've got some stuff that we want, some other psychotherapeutic techniques of the present. Maybe we want to borrow from them. So it's a really great way of putting this stuff together. It's committed but non-dogmatic, you can say. And I would say that, again, this is the fruit of obviously spending a lot of time not only studying these traditions, but also practicing the traditions and engaging with them. It's really well thought through. She is very realistic about what can be done and what can't be done using these approaches, and is quite charitable, I would say, quite objective, you might say, as well, in the sense that she's getting at the object and trying to remove herself as much as possible from any sort of distorting considerations, without saying, "Oh, I'm the view from nowhere." She's not doing that sort of thing. It's very honest in its approach, and I like that as well. I wanted to pick out a particular set of passages. This is coming from about middle way. This is in the More Than Happiness section. And she says that, what do these traditions have to offer a skeptical reader of today? A common approach, if we wish to avoid adopting metaphysics that doesn't suit a scientifically informed worldview, is to cherry-pick bits of advice to make us happier or more successful. Take mindfulness, for example. While secular mindfulness-based methods of meditation were originally developed for therapeutic purposes, it's now being claimed to help with all sorts of other goals, from making money to spicing up our sex lives to losing weight. And you might expect at that point for her to be saying, well, we're going to get away from that. She says, there's nothing wrong with cherry picking per se. In some sense, that's what I'm advocating in this book. The problem is when what's picked only skims the surface of what is on order. These are demanding traditions that challenge our customary ways of being in the world and the values that ordinarily dominate our life. That's an excellent way of framing it. Cherry-picking, eclecticism, smorgasbord approaches, they often are very surface level. This is the problem with life hack philosophy, right? It doesn't get deep enough, and it doesn't put enough of those parts that have been cherry-picked back together. And that is really what she's advocating for, doing the opposite of that. Cherry-picking, but cherry-picking the right stuff and then arranging them in relation to each other and consolidating it with practice. So, I like that sort of approach, and I also like the honesty about it. Another thing that's really great about this work are the exercises. And here I'm going to do a little bit of a rant. So I've looked at and reviewed a lot of recent books about Stoicism. Also, to some degree, I haven't reviewed them so much, but I've looked at a lot on Buddhism as well. And they tend to circulate the same basic sets of practices, right? Everyone on Stoicism includes negative visualization. There's usually a paragraph devoted to it, and it's usually not done particularly well, and it sounds like everybody else's version of it. So when you come across a chapter about practices, or as she's calling them, meditations, and there's actually quite a few contained in other chapters in the book, and they're really well put together, well thought through, well described. That's kind of unusual. And so I'm really happy with not only what she's picked, but how she has expressed it. Again, real expert writing here. The other thing that I do want to say that I find compelling about this work is she's doing really excellent comparative philosophy in here, and doing so without going into, super great depth. Again, there's just enough given to the reader to sort of promote their own thinking about this and to get them steered in the right direction. So those are some of the really high points of this work for me. Now, it wouldn't be a Sadler's Honest Review if I didn't have a few minor criticisms of the work, and they are indeed quite minor. The first one that I have is that I think for the casual reader, there could be a little bit of confusion in how she's talking about the Stoics as aiming at getting rid of all emotion. And there is some discussion in there about, can we distinguish passions from emotions? And so she is doing her due diligence in that way. I still think that some of the things that she's saying could lead people to think that the Stoics are only recognizing emotions as problematic or bad and trying to get rid of them, when the Stoics, as she does discuss in here, did distinguish what we call the good emotional states, the eupathe, right? Rational fear, rational desire, rational joy. And again, this is a very minor complaint because she is handling it. I do think that a casual reader could still get mixed up about it. But now that I think about it, maybe that's the casual reader's own fault for not paying close enough attention to what's being said. Another thing that I don't really buy that she says, and this is in the chapter on living in accordance with nature, is that the Stoic theory of indifference is connected with their view that the universe is providentially ordered and arranged in the most rational way. So we should willingly go along with whatever unfolds for us in the world. And I don't think that the doctrine of the indifference, namely that there's a range of things that most people call goods, which are neither good nor bad. They're only preferred or dispreferred or rejected. This is a Stoic idea, and there's much more to say about this, but I'm not going to go into detail here. None of these are actually good or evil in any real sense. I don't think that that is, in fact, connected with the doctrine of providence. I mean, I think you can connect it up together and say, well, if you buy both of these at the same time, then this follows, which seems to be what she's saying, but I don't think that there's any intrinsic connection between the two. I think you could buy into one, namely the doctrine of the indifference, without buying into the other, the doctrine of providence, which is what many modern Stoics, in fact, do. The other thing that I'll say is that I think I would have liked to have seen discussion of another way of framing more than happiness. So, the Stoics talk about eudaimonia, and there's a lot of discussion in here, and that's very good. And in the chapter devoted to more than happiness, right, the sort of linchpin of the book, what else is happiness? Well, it's equanimity, good flow of life, all these sorts of things, which Macaro is quite good about unpacking and going into detail about. But one thing that I didn't see in here that I think is important for the Stoics, and you see this in Cicero's presentation of Cato's views in On the Ends, Book 3, in Seneca's letters, in Epictetus to a certain degree, and in other places, is this notion that what really matters is moral goodness. And that's not distinct from happiness. If you are aiming at moral goodness, which is encapsulated in virtue and the four virtues, you are going to be happy. But it's a kind of happiness that goes beyond typical eudaimonistic views on things. And so I think I just would have liked to see a little bit more clarification of that in there, because it is part of traditional Stoicism. This is why some people think there's a really solid, strong deontological side to Stoicism, and they almost view the Stoics as, like, in some respect, Kantians before Kant. It's a controversial topic, but I thought it's good to bring up anyway. So I don't have a lot of deep, serious complaints or criticisms of the work. Those are my only nitpicks. All right, final thoughts and assessments. First off, let me just say I unqualifiedly recommend this book. It's really good. I don't think that it's just a book for beginners, although I think beginners can really benefit from it a lot. I really enjoyed this book myself as somebody who I would say is sort of like expert level in terms of the theory and cognitive stuff, and sort of intermediate level in terms of practicing at least Stoicism, not so much Buddhism, right? But I really enjoyed reading it. I think it's very insightful. I think that practitioners of either side could actually get a lot out of having Macaro as an interlocutor, somebody to say, well, what about this? Why don't you think about this? So I think it's really a wonderful book, and I recommend it. There's, as you just heard me say, there's not much bad I can say about it, and actually even the stuff that I said isn't really bad. It's just sort of like little asides. So yeah, I'm really a fan of this work, and I would recommend it.